Welcome to Reframing the Questions. I'm so glad you're here, and I hope this feels like a safe place for thoughtful conversation. The first part of our theological framework is equal value, equal dignity. And this means that as Christians across all denominations, we have a shared value that God has created all life and He has put His image into each and every one of us. We call that the Imago Dei, the image of God, and we value the Imago Dei in every person equally. Now, if you're like me and you grew up in church, you might have heard one particular passage of scripture used a lot to talk about this in the abortion conversation, and that's Psalm 138, verses 13 through 16, where the psalmist is saying, David saying, God, you saw me before I was born. You actually wove me together and you created me. All my days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. You see me, you know me. This beautiful picture of God's involvement, his personal involvement in each and every one of us. And when I heard that in church, I heard that as the child. Before the child is born, God is involved, and that is why we have our views on abortion that we do. And I remember this was after I was leading the pregnancy organization, maybe a year into being in the middle of all this tension. And again, knowing that I wanted to value the woman and child equally. But I specifically remember walking through the hallway one day, and I just sensed, I didn't hear anything, I just sensed in my mind that it was the Spirit saying to me, you know that passage in Psalm 139? And I was like, yeah. And I sensed him say, that is just as much about the woman. And it was like, boom. It was another one of those moments where I was like, oh my gosh. You know, it's the moment where it's like, this is so true. I know it's true. How have I not seen this before? And this is why we have to take the time to step back and question our assumptions. Here's the thing on this. Some people are really afraid to question assumptions, and I think that minimizes God, who He is. He is big enough to handle our toughest questions, and He's big enough to speak to each one of us. Now, it's different for every person. We sense Him differently, but that's why we have each other in community, and we have the scriptures that we look to, and we're paying attention in our spirit, and we're spending time with Him. We don't have to be afraid to question things because He is so good and He is so wanting to communicate with us that He can help reframe. And that's what happened to me in that moment. I was like, oh my gosh, why are we only telling half the truth? And I became passionate about not telling half the truth, about really embracing all the truth, equal value, equal dignity. Man, we have to have abortion conversations within that framework. And to be honest, this was the first place I started realizing we had to completely detach from the political binary because by very nature of making laws, they're pitting the woman against the child, right? Do you going to advocate for the needs of one or the other? Are we going to pass laws for one or the other? And so while we all need to vote, obviously, we also need to think about this from this perspective of God sits outside of that and He does not see the two in conflict, right? He doesn't see that conflict. So that's the first place we start from. One other nuance with this that's been really helpful for me, and this was more of just a gradual realization, maybe through my own pregnancy. I actually became pregnant with my second child the day I started leading the pregnancy organization, which is another story, or the week, I should say. When I looked back at the calendar, I don't know that it was the day, but it definitely was the week, right at the beginning. And that is that God could have chosen to create life any way He wanted, right? We already talked about how big He is. He is the one who chose pregnancy. So we can't have the abortion conversation without thinking about God's design of pregnancy and all of the ramifications of that, which is He chose women. So we're going to talk about women and how the church views women. That question is going to come up a lot. And He also chose to have two people intertwined, right? He created life through pregnancy. And so this is where we have to think about the fact that He has made it impossible for us to try to help one person and bypass the other. That's why the binary should feel really uncomfortable for Christians, because on some level, we know this. And so as we go forward with these conversations, when we have this mindset of equal value, equal dignity, pay attention, even as you're listening to the questions and I'm talking with people. Is there any trigger when you hear anything? And then step back and say, why is that? Because I have found a lot of Christians, we fear kind of what happened to me. My colleagues feared that it was a zero-sum game, meaning as I elevated the needs of the woman, I was going to decrease the needs of the child, because that's all we've seen happen in the culture. But that's not how God works. It's not a zero-sum game. As we elevate women, we actually elevate children as well, because of how God has created children and what they need and the welfare of the people, the family system, and people supporting. We are interdependent. And so we are not going to raise the value of one and lower the other. We're going to ask God to expand our imagination of how He values both and how we can as well. So thank you so much for watching this, and I really recommend you watch the next video in the framework series where we dive into grace.